Welcome to this new creative culture webinar. I'm Ginevra and I'm here today with my colleague Paola. So let me introduce the speakers for today. So we have Paola. She's our account director here at Creative Culture and has been with us for almost 4 years, during which she has focused on developing strategic frameworks in a cross-cultural context, both with and for our clients. Then we have Vijay. He's a semiotician, a strategist, and an anthropologist. He's originally from Mumbai, but based in New York. And he leads a cultural consultancy that specializes in semiotics and cultural strategy. Then last but not least, Brian, who's a doctor in philosophy and the proprietor of a philosophical consulting firm that provides semiotic analysis to companies looking to develop their communication and marketing strategies. To give you a quick overview, Paola will start with a short introduction on how we work with semiotics here at Creative Culture. We will then pass it on to Vijay and Brian, who will interactively start with a more theoretical definition of the discipline, then leading to into how this is applied to communication and marketing. So now, without further ado, I'll leave the floor to Paola.
Thank you, Gigi, and nice to see you all on this webinar. Thank you so much for taking the time, and I hope what we'll be discussing will be very useful for you. My bit is probably the least interesting, but just to give you a bit of context on how creative culture actually got to use semiotics, because it's a relatively new field for us as well. So Gigi, if we could move to the next slide. To just give you a bit of background on, most of you know obviously how we work and that we started out as a transcreation agency, but as Melanie set up the business and as things evolved, she actually found out really quickly there was a really big gap in the market in terms of understanding how culture plays a role in language as well. Language is often the afterthought and the result when the cultural difference is already sort of a problem or becomes a problem. So she set up the business in a way where we started to incorporate services at an earlier stage of the localization process, where we try to help clients to raise a bit of awareness of cultural difference and understanding how, rather than seeing that as an obstacle, it can be an opportunity to learn from each other and actually to connect with your consumers in a deeper way. So we have service packages such as local market intelligence and cross-cultural audits, which some of you might have worked on. But what we've been noticing recently is that a lot of our clients have started to ask the question why more in a deeper way than perhaps before. Data in the current day and age is no longer enough. In order to connect with audiences, it's really about understanding why people behave in a certain way and why trends are the way they are. And in order to do that, you need to go beyond the local insights, beyond the behavior that you can identify. So it's about sort of the deeper sentiment, the deeper perception of local cultural groups and audiences. And part of that is association. So it's about understanding, I have come up with this idea and I think it's great and it might work in my market, but in a different market, maybe it's associated with something else, and this could be problematic in the way I'm trying to transfer my message. And obviously semiotics being the science of image, and that plays a really big role in that as well. It's not just about words, it's also about how you see things quite literally. So we started applying semiotics in 2 different ways in our service offering, mainly in the pre-launch stage. So a lot of clients will develop a concept and then want to test it in market before they either go into rollout directly or they test with actual audiences. And semiotic is a really good and relatively quick way for clients to understand, like, oh, is there a really big issue with what I'm trying to portray here? But we've also started doing it post-launch, so really to help our clients understand, oh, this campaign was super successful, that's really great, but I want to understand why audiences connected with this so much, and if there's any sort of best practices that we can incorporate in future campaigns. So there's those 2 kind of elements. And the main benefits for our clients and what we're seeing and what we're getting as feedback is that it really helps sort of prevent crisis management. So at the very last minute, having to change a campaign and actually spent quite a lot of money on potentially changing imagery, films and shooting, that is obviously quite a bit investment. So this is what really helps them, and also the best and worst practices for future campaigns can be really helpful input for them. A very recent example of a project we worked on, which was very exciting, was a series for UNICEF. It was called Coping with COVID, and it basically followed a group of young girls who are quite vulnerable in developing countries, and they were explaining their current situation, but through the lens of the COVID crisis. So obviously these girls are already disadvantaged, but what the series did really well, and what we sort of developed to understand through semiotic analysis, was the way they spoke about their problems, the way they were very empowering, and that really connected with audiences across different markets. So the client found out what was sort of the success formula behind the way they had shot it, quite unintentionally, and they are now more aware as they're creating a second series on how to implement that. So that's just a very concrete example how semiotics has helped one of our clients. But I'd like to hand over to Brian now for some more in-depth knowledge and an introduction to the actual science.
All right. Well, thanks, Ginevra and Paula. It's great to see how this is being used, and being used so well in the field of marketing, and all of this sort of how we present our understanding across different cultures and different markets. So what I'm going to talk about here is a bit more of the theoretical side of things. First of all, just what is semiotics? It's a word of relatively recent popularity, although a fairly old origin, with roots all the way back in ancient Greece and developed by the philosopher John Locke. So there's a lot of different ways in which we might go about trying to understand it or define it. You can look at it as the normative science of truth is one of the ways that it has been defined, which I find fascinating and a great launching point for investigation. You can look at it as an extension or an expansion of the classical discipline of logic, or even an expansion into the classical trivium at a speculative level. So looking at grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and how all of these things converge in our ability and our efforts to communicate. But I think the simplest and the most approachable definition is that it is the study of the action of signs. And this is a definition which can apply both across the theoretical and the practical investigations of semiotics that we can carry out. So in the theoretical side, what is the action of signs as such? What are signs? What do we mean by the word sign? And then practically, the study of the actions of these or those particular signs. How do these actually come to be interpreted and understood and viewed? Of course, I think what this really requires us to ask, just very briefly here, because this is obviously a very deep topic, is what is a sign? Now, all of us have certain familiar signs that we're very comfortable as recognizing as signs, stop signs or other traffic signs, exit signs, open signs, this way, that way, et cetera, et cetera. But really, signs are everywhere. They are ubiquitous. Everything we do as human beings or as animals is in some way dependent upon the presence of an interpretation of signs. Now, I'm looking out the window right now and seeing the leaves turning, yellow and red and brown. And that's a sign, of course, of the seasons change. So even in that color, that different color of the leaves, there's a sign there. Well, that might also be a sign on a certain tree of a sign of something like a fungal infection. So there's all sorts of different ways in which one and the same thing can be interpreted differently as it functions as a sign. Or you could look at the expression on your friend's face. Maybe it's a sign of pain, or maybe it's a sign that your friend is holding back a laugh. These are different ways in which one and the same thing can be viewed and interpreted differently. And so while some signs are consciously expressed, others are implicit. And one of the intrinsic benefits to semiotics, about which I'll say more in a minute, is that it helps us really understand how we can interpret these signs, both the conscious and the implicit. And I think Vijay will have a lot more to say about that as well. But what's really germane and central to this point is that signs are not simply these things that we see or that we hear in our environments. That signs are really a kind of relation. When we see the stop sign, our minds, being people who know what a stop sign is, our minds are directed to the law that we have to stop here. But we can all imagine someone who has no familiarity or knowledge of stop signs whatsoever. Well, their mind seeing that stop sign isn't directed to the law. And so the functioning of something, of anything as a sign, is entirely dependent upon the relations that it has, both to what it signifies and to the person who is viewing that sign or seeing that sign in some way. And so if we can move on to the next point, though, for the sake of brevity, the question of how does one become a semiotician, or I think we might also phrase it as, how does one learn about semiotics? From a very practical standpoint, it's something that isn't formally studied or recognized in a lot of universities yet, or if it is, it's kind of marginal. There's a few universities in the world that have departments of semiotics, the most prominent probably being the University of Tartu in Estonia. But there's a growing recognition, for instance, and if I can put in a little plug here, I'm working with the University of Coimbra in this coming year to do an online seminar, a year-long seminar on semiotics, looking at it both historically and in terms of particular issues, practical issues, etc. But you can also find LinkedIn groups and Facebook groups that will give you a little bit more information about semiotics and where to go to study it. Along these lines, though, one thing to be conscious of is that there are two different schools of semiotics primarily. It's not exactly a homogeneous discipline that you can just study and everyone agrees about, like really anything, I think. So very broadly, it's been divided into two schools since the beginning of the 20th century. There were two founders sort of independently who set up the idea of semiotics in Europe, Ferdinand de Saussure, whose school is probably the better known, particularly in Europe. He called his study itself semiology, but he's followed more or less by Roland Barthes, Algirdas Gramai, Louis Helmslev, and Yuri Lotman. Whereas in the United States of America, the semiotics was founded by Charles Sanders Peirce, whose work was sort of lost and not recognized for a particularly long time for lots of complicated reasons. But it was maintained by Charles Morris, the importance of the work of Charles Peirce. And then this was passed on to Thomas Semiotics, through whose influence Peirce has really come to be recognized and his work recovered and promoted. And it's along those Peircean lines of semiotics that my own mentor, John Dealey, came into the field. So very briefly, the principal distinction between these two schools of semiotics is really the range and extent to which the study of the action of signs can be and is applied, with a caveat, of course, that a neat and clean distinction is not always going to work in categorizing how a semiotician approaches his or her work. But very generally, the semiological school concerns itself with the signs of language, that is, or signs as they are permeated by language. And so in this, its attention tends to remain more on the domain of culture, whereas the Peircean semiotic school tends to look at signs as really ubiquitous throughout the entire universe, spanning nature and culture. And the second difference is that where Ferdinand de Saussure thought of the sign relation as constituted principally by two elements, the signifier and the significate, or the object which is signified, Peirce thought of the relation as irreducibly triadic, meaning that in every sign relation, not only are there signifiers and significates, but there are also what he called the interpretant. And the interpretant being the one who is so determined by the signifier, or we might call it a sign vehicle, as to be thereby oriented towards the object signified. And I think it's here in this understanding of signs as relations and as irreducibly triadic relations, invariably including the interpretant, or the one making the interpretation, that we can really see how semiotics does benefit our clients. And so the functioning of sign vehicles, the signifiers, that which accomplishes this relation, the more that we can understand how different sign vehicles constitute these relations, the better we can discern the nature of the relations which will come into being through their use. And then secondarily, I think understanding the relation specifically between the interpretant and the object or the thing signified. And here, for the work that creative culture is doing in particular, this is where the notion of a code becomes incredibly important. A code being a sociocultural norm or convention of interpretation. That is, whether it's something visual or auditory, excuse me, can't talk today, or explicitly semantic, something using words explicitly, whether in writing or speaking. Because all of these are perfused with certain semantic and semiotic relations. So whether something's an image, it's a shape of something, a certain sound, a certain pitch, all of these things are perfused with these semiotic significances. And so just to wrap up here a little bit, sign vehicles, they come in endless individual varieties, but there are certain recognizable typologies which can help us to quickly discern the kinds of relations which are likely to come about depending upon how this relation is being constituted. So for instance, if you have any familiarity with semiotics at all, you might have heard of the trichotomy of icon, index, and symbol. These are very commonly used and commonly discussed in semiotics. And so when you can recognize how a vehicle functions as a symbolic signifier, you can get a better understanding of the kind of indeterminacies that someone might come to determine in interpreting the meaning of that symbol. And also, indexical signifiers, the kinds of associations that people create, obviously very important for these cross-cultural audits and cross-cultural analyses. And so to just wrap up my part right here, the relation between the interpretant and the object it's always complex. It's never something that we can say determinately, definitively, that it's necessarily going to be this one thing in all cases. The manner of the sign vehicle, that signifier, never fully determines the interpretant to seeing the object as we would have it be. There's no guarantee that you can create these kinds of relations in the way that you want to. And so being ignorant of the interpretant, not knowing where the interpretant is coming from, we end up making guesses with how and how well the sign vehicles we create will help our interpretants, our audiences, to perceive the objects. And I think we thereby open ourselves to appearing shallow and callous and inauthentic, to becoming perceived as, and perhaps in fact, as manipulators, rather than as honest interlocutors in demonstrating things to our audience. And so I think with that might be a nice way to hand it off to the second half of the presentation and to Vijay.
Hi, Ron. Thanks for that theoretical perspective. That was super useful, super interesting. And thanks for having me, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. So in the business world, the term semiotics is often interchangeably used to imply cultural strategy. Fact is, semiotics is the most intellectually rigorous, sophisticated, and predictive tool that cultural strategy has at its disposal. Now, at a practical business level, right, semiotics is used most commonly to first and foremost identify the rules that govern any cultural phenomenon, what Brian referred to as codes. So, for example, the idea, that in England and Scotland, it is not mandatory for restaurants to display food hygiene ratings. That would be a rule or code that underpins a social contract of trust between restaurants and patrons. So it's one of the rules that underpins the experience of dining out. If you could show the next slide, that's semiotics. It's also used to determine potential opportunity gaps for positioning. It can help identify strategic directions and improve decision making. Now, essentially, semiotics helps you understand how meaning and ideologies are constructed and embedded in culture. You can group codes together to understand themes and broad trends, while also making distinctions among codes to get a sense of which codes are weakening, which social rules have a massive impact on how meaning is interpreted, and which rules are nudging us in the direction of transformation, of cultural transformation. And semiotics can also use a quadrant analysis / semiotic square framework to figure out opportunity spaces. Semiotics is very often used to decode packaging as well, to understand how the client, brand, and competitors are embedding messages when a customer first picks up a product. And that kind of communication has to be extremely efficient. Now, the logo has to communicate something, preferably a sensation that is familiar and emotionally resonant. And the same goes for different elements that are present. For example, there's this example of a noodles sort of like, package. And this noodle example, right? I mean, the bowl offers a classic direction on how to serve Maggi. It's a bowl you'd see at home. So it's in comfortable surroundings, so on. And creates comfort. And once upon a time, right, Maggie used to be a Sunday morning treat. Nowadays, the phrase 2-minute noodles, which by the way has often been made fun of in India because it rarely takes 2 minutes to cook. It's actually intended to communicate the continued promise of fast to cook, ready to eat, which is a phrase used in television commercials for Maggie. This example right here. So that working women, so that working women can see themselves as loving mothers. Now, I wanted to talk about 2 commercials in the context of this conversation on semiotics. The first one is a Pepsi commercial. Hopefully, you've all seen it. The point that I'm making is that basically semiotics is incredibly useful when you're decoding communication of any kind, broadly speaking. So it's especially useful for ad agencies, PR agencies, and the like. And it's a bit underused at the moment, but I think that's something that is about to change because cultural strategy is turning out to be a hugely, hugely influential approach, given the world we live in and all the social justice movements we're seeing. The semiotics is really useful when it comes to creating guardrails and offering guidelines on what works, what doesn't at the storyboard stage. Let's take a look. I think we've all taken a look at that notorious Pepsi commercial from 2017, right? I was just talking about that, featuring Kendall Jenner, which I think in a sense helped people see why it's so important to be culturally sensitive. The ad was such a disaster that it may have almost single-handedly created the demand for cultural strategists. Now, this ad that you see here, right? I mean, the storyboard that you see, this is a hyper-produced ad. Okay, Skip Marley's song "Lions" plays over. It's an optimistic song. You see cheering protesters from a variety of ethnic and representation, sort of backgrounds, wearing smiles on their faces. There's a Muslim girl with a hijab. Suddenly, the focus switches to an incongruous image of a glamorous Kendall Jenner. We're suddenly presented with a classic Asian stereotype. A man playing a cello. Just because he's wearing a beanie, by the way, doesn't make anything better. He sips from a Pepsi can, right? And Pepsi, by the way, hasn't earned any credibility yet, and already yet, right? I mean, we're seeing a product placement. That's a little weird. So we see, white women making funny faces on the ad. Whereas the hijabi is serious, almost glum, angry. She runs out to document the protest, and suddenly Kendall Jenner, right, is invited by that cute cellist to join the protest. She whips off her blonde wig and passes it on to this very perplexed-looking black woman. And what on earth was that, if not suggesting that this white Armenian girl still outranks the black girl who's not svelte enough, to appear like a model? You see, token figures that conveniently signal transgender and gay at once, to the average viewer, through the story. And okay, you think, you still let's give the benefit of doubt to the ad. Maybe the ad is seeing this as an opportunity to teach a girl like Kendall Jenner a thing or two about cultural sensitivity. As it turns out, no, that's not where the ad is going at all. Okay, one of the most significant problems with this ad is that it tries to ride the theme of inclusivity, but the optics make it seem like Pepsi is essentially opportunistically co-opting all kinds of movements at once. Worse, who is the subject here? There are two subjects. One, Kendall Jenner. Two, the can of Pepsi. The ad, right, makes the recognizable, white model girl, Kendall Jenner, it tells us, look, she isn't really blonde. She's in fact a part of the minority, she's like whipped off her wig at that point, right? And therefore a part of the marginalized community. And she becomes a leader of the pack, so the average well-meaning white viewer can feel comfortable that while change is coming, it is an eminently controllable narrative and remains told from the perspective of the white gaze. Kendall Jenner becomes a Trojan horse of sorts. While she can't destroy the momentum of the protests, right, the conversation gets hijacked at any rate. Now, crucially, right, the ad avoids any talk about class. It makes it exclusively about race and representation. Now, the real question isn't whether Kendall Jenner is white or not. It's whether a certified 1%er is qualified in any way to lead a movement simply on the basis of having a recognizable face and surname. It's as if the people in charge of decision making here, right, ask themselves, who is a good face to slap onto this ad? Who's young, beautiful like a model and an influencer? Yes, Kendall Jenner. Let's pick her. And but this ad would be just as much a failure if it used a figure like Meghan Markle, or anybody else who might be a person of color, but ultimately not truly representative. Now, the end result disenfranchises the marginalized all over again. This time by acknowledging these decentered protests in a token manner, but then installing a figurehead, who is wholly inappropriate and unqualified. Now, the ad, right, feels inauthentic, artificial, and fake. Ironically, just like the Kardashians. And the ad, right, is completely insensitive to groups and manages to miss the spirit of the times entirely. Now let's contrast this ad against the other ad that I sort of supplied here, and the Bhima Jewelers ad, right? It humanizes the transgender experience and explores, this narrative in such a fantastic way, I think. Now, the music that plays in this ad is it's not contextualized by words. It's just music that is dreamy, floaty. What you're really talking about is an idealized existence. It feels like a safety net. There is no challenge to the narrative. There is no tension. Those are all facts that we sort of like lay out at the start. The point of the ad, though, here isn't realism. It suggests how the world could be. This is a conscious choice. A gentle nudge towards utopia. And this is a hugely likable ad, partly because A, it doesn't demonize anyone and call any groups out for hatred, and B, because it humanizes someone's transformation with spectacular yet calm emotional resonance. This ad, right, works well precisely because it makes the disenfranchised human being the subject. Right? It makes the disenfranchised human being the subject, puts them front and center, and lets us see how beautiful they are when they're being themselves. It strips away every other competing narrative you hear in the mainstream media globally. Transgender people wanting to use female bathrooms, transgender people assaulting girls in bathrooms. That transgender women are in fact men, that they shouldn't be allowed to compete in sport. You see all of these sort of like problematic narratives that have emerged globally. But here, right, we're really seeing a human being for the human being that they are. Someone who seeks happiness and unconditional love like the rest of us. Now, the ad works because the metaphor, right, compares jewelry to the purity of unconditional love. And it is an exquisite, perfect example of a brand demonstrating fearlessness and cultural sensitivity at once. It does not feel forced because the metaphor comparing jewelry's purity to unconditional love is intuitive. And at the same time, the brand is actually doing something risky by standing for progressive values, because a lot of people associate jewelry with enduring, unchanging values. particularly in the Indian context. Folks often associate jewelry with a streak of conservatism, because some of the strongest conservative traditions manifest in the context of marriage, and that's when people really bring out the big guns. All their gold and jewelry, and this brand, right, is actually it's managing to say you can be as conservative as you want, but marriage can be for everyone, and we ought to respect everyone on their terms, not just ours. And that's why conservative versus culturally sensitive is a false binary. So the central question in the context of cultural sensitivity is, who is telling the story? And by the same token, who is the subject?
Thank you so much, Vijay and Brian, for this. Really, really inspiring. I'm sure this is sentiment shared by everyone. So now the floor is open for questions. Free to share them in the chat. In the meantime, perhaps I can actually just ask this to both of you. So unconscious association can also translate into unconscious or unintentional bias. So how is semiotics applied in a DE&I context?
So from my perspective, DEI is a very complex issue. It's certainly about representation, but at the same time, right, it is more than just about being represented. It's imperative, it's of utmost urgency, I would say, that we go so far past representation. I don't believe ideas like, for example, like purpose, empathy, I don't believe they're the solution. They're a great starting point, but they're not the solution. Now, there's a real threat that these concepts have been reduced to buzzwords, firstly. Plus, more often than not, right, we confuse empathy with identical resonance. We've got to look past the idea that we need to feel what someone else is feeling. There's only so far we can go with purpose and empathy that is, constructed as identical resonance. We've got to very carefully examine the power dynamic at play when we carelessly use such terms. Now, here's a real problem. Okay, now what happens more often than not is that representation becomes a binary issue, white versus minority community. And if you're going to pit one community against another, right, empathy, which has already anyway been reduced to sort of, identical resonance, becomes even harder to activate. Now I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I've concluded that, there's layers of privilege, okay, white privilege, wealth, so on. But there's actually no greater privilege in this world than being taken seriously. Now, I love the Bhima jewelry ad because it takes what appears to be on the on the surface, it appears on the surface to be an ad about identity politics, and it kind of elevates it to become about unconditional love. There are no enemies in this ad. It's purely about what is possible if you all come together, and it's not about brand making. This brand making a statement. It's not saying, look at us, we're fixing the world. It's about great storytelling, told with effortless empathy, and that doesn't make it about empathy. It's also about warmth and emotional resonance. Now, we all understand the concept of pure as love. And when you ground an idea like difference in something very tangible, something very concrete, and then elevate it to a universal abstraction, right, then you start getting somewhere. Now, I think emotional resonance is the magic sauce for DEI. And semiotics is fantastic in understanding how to set up emotional resonance. Now, when I was getting my PhD, I designed a quadrant analysis framework to understand interpersonal and brand consumer dynamics. Okay? And I identified 4 discrete behavioral areas that underpin all storytelling. Now, there's neurotic, there's provocative triggering, there's narcissistically benevolent storytelling, and there's emotionally resonant storytelling. Now, yeah, sure, some of this depends on the brand's identity, consumer base, and other factors. But creating storylines that are emotionally resonant, and on the basis of semiotics, that effortlessly transcends ideas like purpose and even empathy. And emotional resonance, I think, connects brand with consumers. That's what gets the job done. I mean, I think I kind of stretched out my answer, but I think that's where I'm coming from. Semiotics is about emotional resonance. It can really, really capture the sense of emotional resonance better than so many other methodologies.
Yeah, and if I can kind of play off a little bit of what Vijay said there, the empathy is not the end all be all. because empathy comes from a place of the same pathos, right? That is what it is to have empathy. And we're not all going to have the same pathos. We're not all going to have experienced things in the same way. That diversity, in fact, really does require some recognition of differences which are not homogenized, which are not common to all people. But you really have to think about, well, what does diversity really mean? Is it that we all absorb into a same culture where we merely have superficial differences? Or is it about those meaningful, emotionally resonant differences which actually foster a greater, I think, strength in any community when that can be acknowledged as different and yet not rejected as an other that is excluded? I think that's a really important thing. And I think semiotics in its attention to reflecting upon how we ourselves as individuals or as communities are interpreting signs helps us to recognize how we are being attuned to others in their otherness from ourselves.
Thank you. We actually received another question. So are things getting more difficult for advertising brands because the world is getting more divided, meaning that there are less signs that are interpreted in the same way? I'll let you.
So I think a lot of times it's about advertising agencies making missteps, partly because their ecosystem is relatively sort of constrained. Sometimes what happens is that ad agencies have some phenomenal ideas and creative execution, all that, but the research that sort of goes in, right, pits these ideas in terms of binaries, oppositions. Semiotics, right? One of the things that semiotics can really do is identify which binaries ought to be leveraged for any particular storyline. Often, like, you find white versus minority, things like that, right? They're false binaries. And it is getting to an extent harder for advertising, the advertising world. But that just means that there's a phenomenal opportunity to be more culturally sensitive. There's a phenomenal opportunity to do work that is truly, truly intelligent and perceptive and dynamic. That's what I feel.
Yeah, and I think part of that, to the question asked, the world it's divided in different ways, I think, than it used to be, and I think that's a large part of the challenge. And the internet, the digital age, has really accelerated this in a way unlike any technology seen previously. That you can't have these simple binaries in all places, in all times, in all cultures. Even I tell people all the time that I think the left and right political spectrum divide is inaccurate to describe the average person's political opinions today. You can have people who hold opinions that might be very conservative according to an older model, and at the same time opinions very progressive. That there isn't a simple sort of blanket presentation. And so discerning, again, going back to that notion of the interpretant, where the interpretant is in their perspective, and really being able to understand that enables us to understand so much better how the signs that we use are going to be able to present objects. And I do think it is more difficult. I think it's going to become more difficult, especially as these generations who have grown up with the internet come into the sort of purchasing mainstream, right, where they become the economic drivers, that advertisers are going to have to become increasingly nuanced in how they present messages so as not to alienate the customers, or at the same time appear as manipulators who are simply trying to latch on to what seems like a popular trend and utilize that to sell their product, like Pepsi tried and failed to do with that miserable advertisement.
Great, thank you both. I think we actually reached our time, and I can't see any other question coming through the chat. So I would like to thank Vijay and Brian for joining us today, and everyone for joining us again. And I'm sure you have enjoyed this. If you have any feedback or any other topic you would like us to cover, feel free to send us an email. And yeah, keep in touch for the recording, and see you in the next webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun. Thanks, guys.
So much,
Thank
Paola.
you.
you.